Hi everyone, welcome to the event. Can I just ask everyone to keep their cameras off if they're not going to be taking part in the Hustings event? Just give some people a second. Chat will be open. We will be moderating the chat, so please keep your conversation civil within there. Just to introduce myself, my name's Connor Hunter. I'm a trustee of Basic Income Network Scotland, who are hosting the Hustings event today. Basic Income Network Scotland is a charity, an educational charity dedicated to helping inform people about universal basic income and all the great benefits that come with it. So without further ado, I'm going to hand straight over to our fantastic host for this evening. Very pleased to have her here. She is an award-winning journalist, has appeared in all manner of print and broadsheet and well-known names. So I'd like to welcome Lesley Riddoch.
I feel there should be a little sort of drum roll bit going in the back of that Begora. Anyway, thanks very much, Connor. Delighted to be here tonight. What a sad bunch we all are in here on a night like this in Scotland in April. It's, you know, it's testimony to the fact that people are really serious about some way to make headway on the terrible inequality that blights Britain and Scotland in particular. And that's really where basic income has begun to capture the public imagination. And I'm delighted that we've got such good candidates here tonight, that we've got your attention and hopefully your questions to try to tease out how basic income could work. There's been a few hustings already on the basic income front, and a previous one suggested that actually there was just some basic information about basic income that was missing. So before we quiz all the candidates, we wanted to have just a little bit of dialogue with two experts, just to get some of the questions that you can spend a lot of time in a hustings kind of working around, which might have a little bit of a more factual base. Before I come to them though, I just want to introduce our candidates. I hope they're all on the screen that you can see them. We have Neil Gray from the Scottish National Party, who's a candidate for Airdrie and Shotts and was the MSP for that constituency. Julia Brown from the Scottish Liberal Democrats, who's a candidate for Perthshire South and Kinrossshire. Alison Johnstone from the Scottish Greens, who's a candidate for Edinburgh Central and a former MSP for the Lothians. Paul Sweeney from Scottish Labour, who's a candidate on the Glasgow list and former MSP for Glasgow North East. And Rachael Hamilton, who's Scottish Conservative and Unionist, a candidate for Ettrick, Roxburghshire and Berwickshire, and former MSP for that constituency. So there's the big five. Just to say by way of introduction, you'll probably have heard that Scotland has already had a kind of dabbling in basic income, and people seem to think there have been perhaps some pilots held, but there haven't yet. What happened was in June of last year, a feasibility study was published laying the groundwork for how a basic income pilot in Scotland could work. That study was led by 4 local authorities: Glasgow, Edinburgh, North Ayrshire and Fife. It was funded by the Scottish Government, and the idea was to demonstrate how a basic income policy could decrease poverty and increase well-being. The other bit of news: last year, Glasgow Council passed a motion calling on the UK and Scottish governments to work together to carry out a trial in the city of Glasgow. Polling in Scotland suggests 2/3 of people support the introduction of a basic income. And of course, the coronavirus pandemic has really exposed the precarious nature of work and perhaps the difficulty of even a generous furlough scheme, nonetheless trying to apply to categories of workers and invariably leaving some people who just fall straight through all the nets, which is one of the things, of course, that a basic income would not do. There are challenges though, and many people are raising some of those challenges about cost, about a pilot in Finland that seemed not to work. And these things are things that it would be great to try to clear up a little bit before we proceed. So that's why we've got Jamie Cooke and Professor Mike Danson, both of whom have spent a long time studying how basic incomes could work. So I'm not quite sure how we'll manage this between you, but let me just ask one question, maybe one could answer, and then let's do a Tweedledum and Tweedledee act with the two of you. So let's just start off well, what's basic income and universal basic income? What's the difference? Jamie, would you like to start?
Sure. So there is no difference. They're the same idea, and there's many kind of terms and names thrown into it. But the idea is a regular payment that goes to every eligible person. It's universal, so everybody gets it. It's unconditional. There are no conditions. You're not expected to be demonstrating that you're looking for work, how you're going to spend that money. It's regular and secure. You know it's going to be there every month directly into your bank account. And it's paid individually.
Right, Jamie,
you have an individual.
Right, so sorry to interrupt you there. You started to kind of break up a little bit.
Sorry, my internet cut there. Sorry. I'm sure I was making really, really profound points.
You doubtless were. Anyway, just, I don't know, but if you've got any other gadgets or devices, maybe you could just close them down, see if we can get all the welly into this stream. Meanwhile, how useful that we have Tweedledum beside you in a virtual sense. Mike, just on this, first of all, why is basic income, if it's such a great idea, why is it not used anywhere in the world?
Various forms of it have been piloted around the world in different ways, experiments. Alaska, for instance, from their oil fund, every household gets an annual payment. So it has been used and is being used in many places. In some ways, for some, it seems too good to be true. For others, it's the unconditional requirement that Jamie mentioned. For many, they want to see people available for work, and they think it would encourage scroungers and skivers and so forth. We'll respond to all.
Is there any evidence for that, by the way? I mean, I think the Finnish pilot particularly was looking at trying to see if people that were given a basic income then tended to pick up employment opportunities more readily.
Yeah, both Finland, and Jamie can talk about that, but also the Dutch experiments. In Scotland, we're interested in UBI, basic income, because of poverty, to alleviate poverty and so on. In the Netherlands, cities have been introducing it for other reasons. They've looked in particular at people's attitudes to work, and they've found actually no overall change. There's a slight increase in people's likelihood of getting a job and staying in a job if they get a basic income. And it's particularly those who are vulnerable already in the labour market. So migrants who've come to the Netherlands and so on. Don't know if Jamie wants to add.
Yeah. Jamie?
Yeah, sorry, my connection's been a right pain. I'm trying to sort it in the background. No, I mean, again, the evidence is shown from around the world that actually people, when you give them security, when you give them the ability that they're not forced to behave in a certain way, they have the choice of how they interact with work, then it can have a really positive impact on them. When experiments were carried out in Canada, the groups that worked less in the experiment were young people who stayed in the education system instead of having to start working, and new mums who chose to use money as a chance to stay at home with their children. Now, we can debate for both those categories if they're what we want to see, but I think it shows that in the majority of cases, it gives people the chance to be flexible, to have choice around how they interact with the labour markets, rather than being forced through it through the current ways. And you mentioned earlier, Lesley, about the Finnish experiment. There was a lot of misreporting of the Finnish experiment. The Finnish experiment was completed as was intended. It had always been expected to be quite a small-scale experiment. What had been asked was to experiment, and they decided against it because there was an election coming up. And what it showed was a huge, really impressive increase in self-perceptions of well-being, of trust in society and of each other. Because actually you start to show people trust, you start to give them security, they respond to that. And I think that's a really positive opportunity for us here in Scotland to build upon.
Yeah, and I do remember, because I did go to an event in Tampere in Finland that talked about this. One guy who'd actually been within that Finnish pilot, who was talking about He'd managed to set up a small business, the creativity and that trust feeling, he said he felt relaxed for the first time, possibly in his life. And there was an increase in the number of people who chose to be carers, which is a point we'll come on to later. So in a sense, the Finnish government, who I think were hoping they would see lots of people jumping into work, didn't see maybe the increase in paid employment they wanted to see, but there was actually huge increases in activity, if you like, in all sorts of different areas. Just a question, would universal basic income replace all other benefits like disability benefits? Mike?
No, it would. If you think of things like disability benefit, housing benefit, they're to meet the costs that certain people in society have to face beyond the rest of us. So disability benefits would continue. Housing benefit, because housing varies across the country so much in terms of rents, in terms of mortgages necessary to get a decent house and so on, housing benefit would also stay. So those big benefits of housing and disability, long-term sickness and so on, those would continue. We ran a series of workshops recently on through the Scottish University's Insight Institute on basic income and mental health. And what came through very strongly there, for a lot of people, their mental health would be much improved if they'd never had the stress and strain of applying for benefits, of having those assessment tests and so on. And also mental health would improve to the extent they may not actually need those benefits. So as a double benefit, pardon the pun, from introducing basic income for people with certain conditions anyway.
Next thing, and Jamie, maybe, I'm not sure which of you has the expertise in which areas, but would it therefore break the bank? I mean, there has been, Ian McWhirter wrote a really interesting column, pretty skeptical about this actually recently, and said that Reform Scotland, with Nicola Sturgeon's support, has proposed a universal basic income of £5,200 a year, given to every adult irrespective of need. This would cost around 25 billion and yet isn't nearly enough to live on. This is, I'm quoting from him directly. That's little more than universal credit, so seems rather pointless.
So I don't think it's pointless at all, because universal credit, sadly, is, and it's been shown through the Audit Office and various others, is sadly kind of doomed to failure under its own expectations and ways of working, let alone what anyone else thinks of it. I think the point is, so we published a report, RSA Scotland, the RSA a couple of years ago, that showed a basic income around those levels. And, you know, this has been the general discussion around Scotland. It's been about £5,000 per year. Even at that level, that's enough to, under Joseph Rowntree Foundation definitions of destitution, eliminate destitution in Scotland entirely under economic modelling, and reduce poverty overall by about half. So it has significant impacts, and that's because it isn't taken away from people. It gives them the opportunity to move between jobs, move into work, have other opportunities that not be penalised for them. And actually, therefore, it can have a very significant impact. So I think we can have a discussion as a country whether it could, you know, we wanted it to be bigger. But actually, those levels, I mean, we proposed 4,800, so you're actually even lower level than Reform Scotland, that still had these impacts on poverty and destitution. That was about 9.6 billion for Scotland. It is deliverable. The 20 billion is also a bit of a false number, because that doesn't factor in the other benefits, as Mike touched on already, that are factored in and are replaced, so removed away. But also, this is an investment in the people of Scotland. This is, you know, we're willing to invest in businesses. We're willing to invest in structures and infrastructure. This is an investment in people, and that investment pays back over time. So where we've seen that, you know, we touched on the work in Canada previously, admissions to hospital drop for a number of serious conditions because people are more secure. They feel better, and as Mike touched on, the impact on mental health is significant. New businesses are created that bring in jobs, that create new revenue streams. And also, I think as a country, if we're talking about a new idea, you know, this is a new system for the 21st century, a new social contract, then we look at new ways of raising revenue. let's look at data, let's look at, you know, land revenue, let's look at different ways of bringing in tax that can contribute into that. So I think it's completely achievable within a Scottish budgetary setup, and I think it's about us being imaginative in how we respond to that.
And Mike, the other complaint, as it were, from Ian was saying the idea of asking basic rate taxpayers to help finance millionaires getting money they don't need is unlikely to be an election winner. I mean, what's the response to that?
Didn't quite understand what Ian's point was there,
because anyone who's a millionaire will get their 500 quid or 5,000 quid a year as well.
And they'll pay tax on their overall income. One of the strange aspects of income tax in Scotland is we're not allowed to vary the upper bands on savings and non-earned income. At a UK level, that is different, and therefore taxing millionaires at a higher rate than it currently, maybe at 60-70%. Remember, Margaret Thatcher, even in the late 80s, was still imposing income tax margin rates of over 80%. So these are not unusual. So Ian Wharton in his column also talked about furlough and how very expensive that was, and debt, national debt. That national debt is our national debt to us. The bank created that money. We don't owe it to anybody but ourselves. So if it can work for furlough, which was a very inefficient way of doing it, then it can work for a basic income.
So final question, chaps, and then we're going to our candidates. On this question, could basic income pilots actually happen in Scotland under devolved powers? You've just illustrated one of the difficulties of not being able to vary the tax rates. Could a pilot work under devolved powers, Jamie?
Jamie.
So I'm a bit sceptical about the ability to deliver pilots. We can't under the current setup. It requires input from the UK government. And, you know, Ronnie Cowan MP asked the Prime Minister's questions yesterday around pilots to take place across the UK, because this is a pan-UK discussion. You know, the First Minister of Wales, very supportive about basic income. You know, significant number of English councils really actively exploring this. And unfortunately, the Prime Minister didn't respond to the question when it was raised. So it requires the UK government, it requires HMRC and DWP to take part. And I think just now that's a challenging situation. But we also are in a position now in Scotland, and, you know, not to take away from the fantastic candidates who are going to come up next, but, you know, 4 out of 5 leaders have said that they're interested in the idea. You know, 3 manifestos have already put some sort of commitment towards basic income across. So, you know, I'm going to put out there that I think the pilots are a useful opportunity. I think the feasibility study was a fantastic piece of work around the interactions with benefit system and devolution. But actually, I think it's about now, and it's actually about taking this forward, and that's the really exciting opportunity we have here in Scotland.
Okay. And just Mike, last thing, there's been a minimum income guarantee talked about as an alternative in the meantime, or even generally. What do you think of that, and how would it work?
It's a stepping stone to a basic income. Again, it's sort of privilege. It doesn't overcome the issues of the disabled and housing benefits, so on, because it's on the income side. It's a minimum income, not basic income. But it's worth looking at that, and the sort of issues, challenges it faces would be similar for a basic income. So even if we just have a minimum income guarantee, it would be a step forward in understanding what the benefits are and the costs and the processes that are required to introduce a basic income in the longer term.
Right, and I'm just seeing questions on the chat that just there's a couple that keep making the same point. So let me just clear this up before you disappear. You can't live off £4,800 a year. This is a component of a basic income. Do you want to speak about that, Jamie or Mike? You know, is that all we're suggesting people live on?
The proposal in the feasibility.
No, and I think this is why.
Jamie, go on yourself.
Yeah.
No, sorry, I can't. I want to go back.
Okay, in the feasibility study, they suggested 2 levels of basic income. One which would match the current universal credit and so on levels, And that would allow us to look at what would be the change in behaviour and so on of people who no longer could be sanctioned and such. Okay, so it would allow us to look at that. They then suggested a higher level at the minimum income standard, the poverty standard agreed by the European Commission, poverty campaigners across the UK, and that would allow us to look at what difference in people's lives came about because of having a higher income level, as well as having the threat of sanctions and such removed.
Right. Okay, well, look, thank you very much, the both of you, for chipping that in. Let me now come to our candidates. Just can I ask you, first of all, each of you, there is a pledge that has been put forward by Basic Income Scotland, which is saying that as a member of the Scottish Parliament, you would support calls to pilot a basic income in Scotland and lobby Westminster for full cooperation to be able to do that pilot. Do you each support that or not? I'm just putting you on the spot straight away, and it's just a kind of yes, no answer on this one, really. So let me go round everybody. Neil, yes, no?
Yes.
Julia, for the Scottish
Yes.
Liberal Democrats?
Yes.
Yep. Alison Johnstone, the Greens?
Yes.
Paul Sweeney, Labour?
Yes.
And Rachael Hamilton for the Conservatives?
I'm the outlier, no.
Okay, right. Sort of why not then, since you are the outlier?
Yeah, well, I think, what I want to gain from this evening is, because it's quite a sort of a discussive hustings, which is quite different to some of the others, because it's specifically around, the aim of increasing well-being and reducing poverty and supporting the most vulnerable people. And I think my point from the Scottish Conservatives is that we could do that in other ways. I think, we've seen the same government in power for the last 14 years. And I think some of the things that have not been addressed, such as, for example, homelessness, 1 in 4 children living in poverty, people not having an affordable home that they can buy, or social housing, the targets not being met. There are so many things that have had an impact on well-being and financial security. And I think that universal credit, as we've seen during the pandemic, has held up very well, with 3 out of 4 people being very pleased, and it was very quick to be implemented. We've now got 500,000 claiming universal credit, and I think it was actually something that was quite resilient at the time. And I can't see, I think we'll move into this discussion. I don't want to take too much time just now, Lesley, because I think we'll develop the discussion. But if I leave it there, perhaps I could.
No, but that's interesting enough, Rachael. You're fundamentally saying that universal credit, it could act as in a better way than basic income.
Yeah, I've got loads of reasons why at the moment I feel uncomfortable with giving millionaires a kind of universal payment, whereas universal credit currently reaches the most vulnerable people in Scotland.
Okay, well, look, let me just go round everybody, because I can see a lot from facial expressions, a lot of people who want to come in clearly on that one. And it does cut to the heart of the existing methods for trying to cope with poverty. Neil, do you want to come in first?
Yeah, I wanted to pick up on some of what Rachael was saying there around poverty levels in Scotland and the investment that she claims has not been made. Of course, and I don't want to detract too much from the actual main thrust of the discussion, which is supposed to be around UBI. But I take the point that we should be, looking at overarching areas around addressing poverty and social inequality. But I really have to pick up with what Rachael was saying there, because in Scotland, we have, for many years in the past 14 years, have been building more social housing units, not just per head of population, but in total, than in England, where her government has been in charge for the last 11 years. And as a result, while poverty levels in Scotland are admittedly too high, and there's areas in our manifesto to help address that, it's still lower than elsewhere in the UK, and that is partly because of the cheaper housing costs in Scotland, because of our investment in social housing, particularly council housing, over the last 14 years. So I really had to pick up on what Rachael was saying there, because it was just factually inaccurate. But going back to my support for piloting UBI, and it goes back to what Mike and Jamie were saying earlier. You know, it is about how we see ourselves best responding to the challenges that we're facing going forward in terms of addressing social inequality and addressing poverty. And whether it's a minimum income guarantee, which we've committed to in our manifesto to happen under a devolved setting, or whether it's UBI, which I agree with Jamie, I think will need to happen in an independent Scotland, I think these are ideas that we should be looking at, because they could be transformative. We need to look at the flip side of that in terms of the potential cost, and also the change, the transformational change that would be required in terms of our taxation system. But I think they are ideas that have merit and that are worth discussing. And I certainly support the pilots going ahead to see how well it could address some of the social inequality that we face here in Scotland.
Okay, I'm just going to let everybody have a chance, in a sense, to have their political answer here, since that's been raised, in a sense, a different political perspective by Rachael to start off with. We will return to some of the aspects of UBI, worry not. So just give it lalde. Alison, how do you respond to that notion that universal credit might well be a better way of running, of trying to sort equality out?
I suppose, as someone who's been on the Social Security Committee for the last session of Parliament and was involved very much in the passing of the Social Security Act, and also a committee that undertook an inquiry into universal credit, where we went out to local communities, we met with people in job centres and so on. I have, you know, it's simply not the case that this benefit is working. A Labour colleague, MSP colleague, and I sat in Musselburgh, actually, where we met with people who were involved in the benefit system, and sanctions were actually appearing on the mobile phone of a gentleman who was not terribly well at the time, telling him that because he hadn't presented himself at X venue at X time, his benefits were going to be reduced. I mean, it was inhumane. I know the complexity for too many people is just, it's off-putting, and we know that billions of pounds of benefits are unclaimed at the same time when people are really struggling and absolutely desperate. So there's a huge question there about take-up. And let's be serious, if we had a blank canvas now, would we really introduce the complexity of the means-tested system that we have now? Of course we wouldn't. You know, with so much of the debate, certainly with the UK government welfare reform, agenda it was around, that horrible rhetoric, the hard-working, versus the shirker and the scrounger. So I think what universal basic income has going for it is it removes stigma. As we've heard, it would give people freedom, a bit of freedom of choice, whether that's to care, to study, to try out an entrepreneurial venture. And I think it's really important that we have a social security system that's worthy of the name and really provides that net for when we need it. And we saw what happened at the beginning of the pandemic. People were panicking, and so many people, interestingly, who found themselves on universal credit, they were writing to me saying, I can't believe you expect people to survive on this. People that had never interacted with the benefit system before could not believe what they were being offered. In Scotland, there's been a big focus by the Scottish Government, which I appreciate, on dignity and respect, but you can't have either of those if you have an inadequate income. And I think what the UK government has done, it's really shocking that they've broken the link between need and social security. The benefit cap simply means that, well, you might need more than this, but you're no getting it, so you will struggle. And as for the 2-child limit and the rape clause, I mean, that's an absolute national shame and an embarrassment. Imagine actually having to prove non-consensual conception in order to be able to make sure the third child in a household had access to the benefits that your older 2 children were entitled. Okay. I mean, things have gone really badly wrong. So I suppose I'm up for a radical change that will, make sure we come out of the pandemic in far better shape than we went into it.
Okay, Paul Sweeney, I'm conscious that it's difficult for everyone because there will possibly be so much agreement. amongst the four of you who are committed to signing this basic income pledge, that actually you will share an awful lot of the same reasons for wanting to do that. But Paul, I mean, within I know this is a Holyrood election, but you know that there is a possibility, since it could fall to a UK Labour government, to be able to do something about this first. What's Labour's position overall on moving towards basic income? Is there an interest south of the border in your party?
Absolutely. I've spoken to Annalise Dodds and Johnny Reynolds on this, and they're very interested in the scheme, and the principles of it are fairly fundamental to our objectives. You know, the key thing for me is that poverty is a fixable problem. You know, it's not an inevitability. We've seen how that plays out. Between 1997 and 2010, when Labour was in government, child poverty went from almost 4 million to 1 million. And it was an unprecedented improvement in the condition generally of households, since reversed back to almost square one by the Conservative austerity programme of the last decade. So we can see that these changes and shifts can occur. I think the basic income principle has been a revelation and a new concept of thinking, and it's actually partly coming through because of the improvements to technology. And I think in many ways, you know, I think looking at my own personal experience of living on universal credit for most of the last year, the changes that were brought about by the pandemic have been quite remarkable in demonstrating actually that all the supposed barriers to access could be remarkably removed and ameliorated just by writing a new line of code in the system. You know, so when I first applied, obviously I had to wait 5 weeks, which is obviously an unacceptable initial period for a lot of people. I had the luck that I obviously had some savings that I could live off of, but my sort of UC, as it works out, is around about £3,400 a year on an annualized basis. It's about £283 a month. When you factor in what savings I've got, which obviously go down every month because I'm relying on that. But what I didn't even realise was, for example, that I didn't realise I qualified as well for New Style Job Seekers Allowance. I only found out like a few weeks ago that I qualified for that. You think as an MP I might have known that, but actually it was so labyrinthine even for me that I wasn't quite sure what. I thought everything had been rolled into UC by that stage. But I also applied for a reduction in council tax. You know, so these are things that they're all these different complex interactions. It's about how do we try and simplify this system? And actually demonstrated to me the pandemic, if there's something positive to come out of this situation, it's a demonstration that actually this kind of idea of UBI is attainable, and it can be attainable in a sort of evolution of the current infrastructure. And sort of, I think it actually makes it easier to do. It's almost like, you know, plonking a frog in a boiling pan of water and it'll jump out versus slowly heating it up. You know, if we can actually evolve the system towards a UBI by sort of stripping out the stupid system that largely because of bigotry from the Tories have implemented, you know, this idea that somehow you're sort of morally defective if you're unemployed or whatever, and also doesn't even is tenured to the idea that 65% of children in poverty are in working households. You know, this isn't an issue about unemployment versus employment. It's the fact that our economy is incapable of paying people a wage that's sufficient to meet their living costs, even when there are employment. You know, so it's actually removing that huge taper and that gulf between, you know, on universal credit, if you're in work, I got a temporary job for 2 months over the summer, it was cut off completely, you know, and then I had to wait another month before I got it back again. You know, so, you know, that's stupid. Why not just keep it going? You know, so these are sort of principles where we could try and improve it. And I think that's where the opportunity lies, working in next parliament. And I'm really interested in sort of cooperating with colleagues across parties. I think that's really good that we've got that kind of consensus on the principle, the idea. But I think there's also a kind of realization that it's not actually that complicated if we really want to do it, because the infrastructure actually lends itself to it now. You know, an increasingly automated system. It's largely online. My interactions with my work coach have been on the phone. It's been actually really friendly with the job centre in Glasgow. You know, and they've been quite supportive. Believe it or not, it's not kind of as, you know, these are workers, PCS union members. You know, they're actually just trying to do a job as well. You know, if they're not feeling under pressure to, you know, sanction people and be horrible to people, they're not being measured on that basis, then the whole system just improves, and morale of both the workers and the people involved with it improve. So I feel we can move in that direction, and we can do it within the next parliamentary term. It's not about waiting for this kind of unattainable objective that's kind of, you know, almost utopian. I think we can get our kind of hands dirty and get in there and fix the system, get it under the bonnet and do something with it.
Right. Well, there's a tremendous kind of peon of praise for the benefits of actually losing your job and being on universal credit for a while.
I'm just trying to be optimistic.
No, I know it, but it is a real set of insights, actually. Let's go to Julia Brown. Julia, from the Lib Dems point of view, can you do anything? I mean, it's like we're stuck here. 4 out of 5 of you want to do pilots in Scotland. It can't happen unless you throw 6, which is to see, you know, a Conservative government in Westminster playing ball in terms of HMRC and the benefits system. So can you see from the Liberal Democrats' point of view any way that you can break that impasse and actually get the show on the road in Scotland, or are we stuck?
I don't believe we're stuck. In the Lib Dem manifesto for the Scottish election, we have UBI as one of our policies in that document. And also Ed Davies talked many times at Westminster about universal basic income and how that can really transform this opportunities for many people. And so I think there are a number of people that are willing to look at the evidence, and I think it comes back to having the right evidence. And so I think the feasibility study we did in Scotland, that's great. I'm sure if we were designing another study, we could take the learnings from that and make it even more robust. And I think it's important to work in partnership with our colleagues in Westminster and elsewhere to try and pool our resources and pool the data so that we can get something which is really powerful. This could be world leading for the UK in terms of identifying a way that we can really support our people to make the best of the opportunities that are available to them. And I think that for people on this call to kind of indicate that the current system is actually working I think beggars belief. I mean, we wouldn't have the poverty levels, the fuel poverty, the challenges that we have if the system was working. And I think there's a fundamental principle that's wrong with the universal credit system in that it assumes that people are gaming the system, that that there's no trust involved in the people in this country. And I think that's really disrespectful, and actually the evidence doesn't bear it out, because when you look at the figures in terms of what comes out of the data at a UK level, less than 10% of the budget seems to have been allocated to potential either errors made by the government or officials, or errors made by the claimants or people fraud. So it is actually a very low number, but we put so much resource into checking up on people and taking the approach that people are trying to game the system, which I think is just not appropriate. And so happy to come back on the details of UBI later, but we think it is something that we need to do because the current system is broken, and we need to come up with something that's much more effective and also much more efficient. I mean, it's just not agile and responsive to change.
Okay. But let me ask you a specific question here, which is to try and just highlight different problems that could be tackled by a universal basic income with different groups. There was a report last year by Care UK that estimated that almost 1 million unpaid carers in Scotland provided unpaid care worth about £10.9 billion since the start of the pandemic. That was just in 1 year, almost £11 billion worth of effort. The universal basic income supporters believe that would really support carers and actually reduce the burden of care on the state. So if you don't believe in that, or if we haven't got a universal basic income fast enough, what other means are there of helping carers? Rachael?
Yeah, sorry, I've never been quick with that unmute button, but I mean, we launched our manifesto this week, and we fully support supporting unpaid carers, and we think that there are a few things that we want to bring in. That we also want to bring in an employability support scheme that would help people to stay in work, but also to get respite at the same time. It's kind of not just about supporting them financially, but there's a big package here to be looked at. And I think that some of the stuff in our manifesto has been really good, where we would prevent unpaid carers falling through the cracks. There doesn't seem to be much joined up thinking around the support package for them. And of course, they do such an unbelievable job, and actually, you know, help our NHS. So they are very valuable, and our party very much value what they do for us.
Okay, on care, let's go to Julia next. Carers.
So yes, massive issue this. I really don't think that the people who care for others in our community have been valued enough to date. And so a very specific thing that is in the Liberal Democrat manifesto is increasing the carers allowance. So we have committed so far to have an uplift of £1,000 for the carers allowance. I'm not sure that that's going to go far enough, but it is our first attempt at trying to put some direct financial support around this area. I think coming back to one of your points, Lesley, is about the siloed nature of adding up how different parts of our community are contributing. So when we look at a cost around universal basic income, then the cost element of that, when it's compared to universal credit, doesn't take into account things like carers that are providing support without remuneration. It also doesn't take into account the charities sector more broadly in terms of how much they are operating and contributing to backfill the gaps made in the current benefits system. And also it's not necessarily tracking all the negative costs that are sitting in the NHS. So when I think you compare the two numbers, I have real concerns that the numbers are encompassing all the current costs in the right way, because they still sit in various silos, whereas the UBI number is an easier number to present. But I think it's unjustified that the current costs are not articulated fully.
Okay, Paul Sweeney, how would Labour deal with the country's social care crisis, Scottish Labour?
Yeah, well, fundamentally, it goes back to the principle of creating a minimum income guarantee. So we want to increase carers allowance for unpaid full-time carers to ensure that's part of that income guarantee, to ensure we have a sort of minimum income floor across all areas of life.
So sorry to just interrupt and be a bit cheeky, but then that's the same as what the SNP is proposing, yeah?
Well, I think we've got a unity of purpose there,
yeah,
you know, around trying to do this in Scotland, and I don't think that's a bad thing, you know.
No, that's fine. I'm just trying to make sure that it's nothing different.
I think the key thing with our ideas around, you know, for example, creating a national care service is to try and also liberate people as well as much as possible, try and ensure that people aren't having to rely on their own equity and transferring their wealth into caring for people, you know, because that's another major cost involved in the issue of caring. So we want to try and establish that on the same basis as the National Health Service. And I think that's got to be a real sort of focus, you know. And the issue around care workers as well has been a huge issue. There's some of the lowest paid people in our, you know, our economy, and you know, valuing that critical care is so important. So by ensuring they've got a proper, you know, living wage, we were proposing a £12 an hour minimum wage for care sector workers, you know, so that's something that would also help improve that situation. So I think building that sort of resilience, extending the eligibility for care, is also improving the taper. So for example, when people lose a loved one that they've been caring for a long period of time, the payment just stops right away. So I think there's got to be an effort to try and ensure that that's appropriately handled. So we're proposing a 6-month period rather than just being immediately cut off, to ensure that there's a more humane approach to dealing with grief, which is something, again, which ties into the whole mental health crisis we're dealing with in Scotland, particularly given the high rate of mortality we've seen in the last year. So, you know, these are things we really want to try and focus on, because I think it's one thing to focus on the death of in the last year, but we're also going to have a huge chronic illness problem coming out of this pandemic as well. I've seen the issues about long COVID and younger people being affected by that as well. So I think we are going to have to be more realistic about how much we value care in our society, and the fact that it's an enabler. And it goes back to that point that was raised earlier in the discussion about a minimum income gives people the opportunity on the basis of security to sort of realise their potential to actually participate in the community, to be productive citizens. They're not living in fear. They're not scared about how they're going to feed themselves, how they're going to care for their family members. You know, I can't. It's like, how do we judge? How do we value and how do we price, if you like, the huge benefits of removing that fear could be for our communities and our country as a whole. You know, I think that's got to be something we have to factor in, and I hope that, you know, that's a good principle for guiding our deliberations in the next few years.
Okay, Neil, and just a matter of interest, how will your minimum income guarantee work in the different fields where you have a wee pinky on control on levers? I mean, how will you do this?
That's obviously going to be developed as the Parliament goes on. We're going to be working towards introducing and ensuring we have a minimum income guarantee over the course of the next Parliament. And part of that is the likes of the new carers assistance, social security support that's coming in, the child payment that's going to get doubled under an SNP government if we're re-elected, and other areas that we're going to be taking control over. But in terms of social care, in terms of support for carers, we've already increased carers allowance. We've brought it up to the level of job seekers allowance, which I don't think anyone would agree is sufficient, but it's a start in terms of providing some acknowledgement to the work that unpaid carers do. And we're going to want to go further with the creation of the new carers assistance social security benefit when that is introduced in the next Parliament. We're also committed to the National Care Service that brings up national standards in terms of the care support that's available, as Paul had said, around bringing it on a par with the NHS, which will also make it more social care more attractive as a potential career, and that is obviously going to be helpful going forward. But this question really brings it back to why I am attracted to the idea of a universal basic income, because for unpaid carers and other volunteers, people who volunteer in our charity shops, who staff our food banks that sadly still have to exist in 2021, so many of these people have their work that is to the benefit of us as a society unrecognised right now, and a universal basic income would not only recognise that incredible work that they do, but would also encourage and free people up, as Jamie and Mike had said earlier, to do more of that type of social good work. One of the areas that we're looking at in this Parliament, if the SNP is successful, is going to be supporting trials of a 4-day week. Imagine what we can do with that extra time if we are successful in bringing forward the idea of a 4-day week and allowing people to have more leisure time, but also more time to be able to volunteer in their local community.
But Neil, in the things that you were mentioning there, the SNP might bring in, there was about 5 different pots of money that could come in. I'm sure if anyone was a carer, they would have been trying to scribble those names down and hoping that there was some way that they could make sure that they would be eligible. I mean, this is one of the things about basic income, that you don't keep having to apply for a little project here, a little pot of money there.
Yep.
Your government could stand accused of just being a bit of a kind of, it is full of pots of money that you need to be pretty expert to weave your way around, or will people get them automatically?
Yeah, so there's we're looking at areas of ensuring that there is better take-up rates and providing potentially statutory obligations to ensure that there's better take-up rates of the Scottish social security benefits that are coming through.
How could you do that? How could you have statutory take-up?
Well, ensuring that there are better advertising programmes, ensuring that we have welfare rights officers that are working in the likes of...
think of something far more fabby? I mean, making the point that Paul made earlier, IT can practically, let's face it, we've just watched a helicopter bouncing around on the moon last week. We've got technology that can absolutely pinpoint everybody where they are at almost any time. Is there not something really cheeky and clever that you could do to just manage to do what, to be blunt, the British government doesn't seem to want to do as an approach, which is to actually just get the money to the people because they're entitled to it?
Yeah, there's a complexity there, though, Lesley, that I'm sure you would accept, that at the moment we've got a hybrid social security system where there are social security payments that are made by the Scottish Government, but are still reliant on DWP cooperation or infrastructure in order for it to be delivered, because we don't have full control over social security in Scotland. I was interested in Rachel's comment in the chat box earlier about the Scottish Conservatives being committed to introducing a taper for carers allowance. I would love it if the UK government would bring that forward, because that would make such a profound difference. Because when we've previously been looking to increase carers allowance, we were told that if we did that, it would be immediately clawed back. So that's where, at the moment, the complexity of having a hybrid system under the devolved settlement, it makes it difficult for us to be able to do everything that we would want to do. And independent Scotland, full control over social security, obviously makes that a lot easier.
Right. Alison, I think you're the one that hasn't had a shout in this question, am I right? Oops, and you've gone a bit muted there, my dear.
Can you hear me now?
Indeed.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah, I think it's really interesting, isn't it? I suppose one thing we need to think about when we come to unpaid carers is that so many people don't realise that they're actually carers. You know, I know situations where it's only when people have sort of been brought to crisis by the efforts that they're putting in looking after someone that they reach out for help, find out they're an unpaid carer, learn about respite, learn about the carers allowance. So there's, you know, there are millions of people who don't realise they're carrying out that caring role, who would benefit from having a UBI. When we come to the carers allowance, the person you're looking after has to get one of a range of benefits in order for you to be eligible. And then there's a whole list of other criteria you have to meet. You know, you can't be in full-time education. You've got to earn, as has been mentioned in the chat, less than £128 a week. Do you believe it? To be eligible for carers allowance. Now, you know, I appreciate Rachel Hamilton saying that, you know, there's discussion amongst the Conservatives about making sure that taper means you don't fall off the edge of that cliff and receive nothing. But really, we could be doing so much better than we are doing. I mean, there's a lot we could be doing around the benefits system at the moment anyway. I don't understand why you have to keep filling out form after form after form every time you apply. Why can't you just fill out a form once? And, you know, you're sort of speaking about this yourself. We are in the you know, it's 2021. Surely you could fill out a form and someone could suss out what you were entitled to without every single application for every single individual benefit being such a trial. I mean, I have gone to visit constituents and I was helping a carer fill out it was a personal independent payment form, and the stress in the household was really quite something. We've got to simplify this system. You know, there are so many interactions. You're not entitled to carers allowance if you're already in receipt of X, Y, and Z. None of this is straightforward, and you just end up thinking, do people really want me to get this entitlement? You know, it is just that feeling you have to jump through hoop after hoop after hoop, and it isn't as straightforward as it could be or should be, because this, you know, people are paying their tax. They are entitled to help when they need it. And as you've said, you know, the last, taken part in a couple of carers hustings already, we're talking about £13 billion worth of benefit to the economy. It's enabling, you know, people like me to go out to work and so on. That's worth investing in.
Mm-hmm. Right, there's loads of questions on the chat. I mean, humongous amounts of them. Some of them are really quite specific about basic income. And I don't know how much, you know, given that we've just discovered that essentially we might have a difficulty even getting a basic income pilot working here if we can't actually get buy-in from the DWP. It might be hard for you to answer these things, but I suppose it would let people know whether you've actually thought about it very much. So can we just have questions here? Let me just try and pick out a couple. Yes, there's one here from Ross in Aberdeen who says to all candidates, what will you do to push back on mis and disinformation in the mainstream media that demeans people who live in poverty and pushes false narratives about a meritocracy and blames people rather than acknowledging systemic failings? So how do you push back on misinformation in the media? There's a difficult question. I'm just going to put 3 or 4 questions up, and I'd like you each to pick one and answer it. And whoever goes first then knocks it out for the rest. So stay limber, folks. So one is about how you push back misinformation on a basic income. how would you ensure that payments of basic income, or indeed minimum income guarantees, given to people with no homes or bank accounts actually means something for them? What about people who have no recourse to public funds? Another question, there are concerns that a universal basic income might entrench traditional gendered roles and see women doing even more unpaid caring work than they do at the moment. What do candidates think about this? So one more, there's that question again, and just there's still lots and lots of questions about this actual rate of UBI and whether or not the rate that was outlined earlier, that's around 5,000 a year, would actually really work to transform people's lives. So can you explain how you think it would, since 4 out of 5 of you are in favour of it? Now, I can't even remember the 4 questions I've just outlined there, so I'm working on the basis that you've been able to scribble a few down. So let's work backwards from those who haven't gone first so far. So could we go first of all to Julia?
Okay, so yeah, those are great questions, and I don't think I got them all down. I think the last one really resonates with me, is trying to choose the right number for UBI, and in terms of the pilots and in terms of the sort of international data, I think that is the real challenge. To me, the number of £5,000 a year doesn't sound enough to achieve all the things that we hope the UBI system will deliver. So I would like to see some more data on this. To me, it feels that should be the minimum level. And I think in terms of how that number has been worked out, I think it's been sort of based on what universal credit has been kind of allocated to different people. So to me, it comes back to that question around silos as well, so that the actual cost of our system at the moment is not properly identified. There's lots of costs that are hiding in different places and not necessarily allocated to the social care system. And so to me, the UBI number of 5,000, it feels too low, and I think it should probably be higher to deliver what we're expecting.
So as a matter of interest, would you be willing to raise taxes in the Scottish government in Scotland to pay for this?
I think there's a number of things that you could do. So I think, first of all, there's a lot of efficiencies that we could get from improving the existing system, and we could try and quantify that to see what the gap would be. I think in terms of raising taxes, we have, various taxation powers at the moment, and I think that the system that we've got is all right, and we could look and see whether or not there'd be further tax rises would be needed. So I think I can't answer the question in terms of the numbers, because I just don't think that we've got the data, which is why I think these pilots and studies are really, really important. And I suppose my question back to others who've maybe had the conversations with colleagues at Westminster and elsewhere is where has the pushback come from in terms of actually doing pilot studies or providing data? It hasn't sounded as if they've been unwilling to provide data when we've asked for it. So I'm not sure exactly where the blockage in the system is to have a collective approach to this opportunity.
Right, my plans for these 4 questions are going awry very quickly, because I can see that you're casting a question out, which is fair enough. Does anybody, obviously Alison's talking about being on the Social Security Committee. Neil's got experience too. Can anybody come into where the exact logjam is?
It's with, if you don't mind, Lesley, it's with the DWP and with the UK government ministers. They have no interest whatsoever in seeing any trials of UBI come forward. The repeated questions that my colleagues, myself, and other representatives, other MPs from other parties at Westminster, when they've requested the permission and the cooperation of the DWP and HMRC, that is where the logjam is. So right. I don't know if hopefully
Rachael,
that'll help. Is
Rachael,
helpful.
Can you not see how blooming irritating this is? Because a very large swathe of political opinion here is all ready to go on this one here in Scotland, and just can't get the British government or the DWP to just play ball enough to have a blinking pilot, which would, if you're right that this is not a very efficient system, and there's lots of people have worries about pilots because unless they really are universal, they don't actually reproduce the effect that you would get of a whole society working on a system. So, you know, what's there to lose in the British government going ahead and facilitating a pilot in Scotland? Because if you're right, you'll find out that it doesn't work.
Well, I mean, I'm obviously not sitting in the UK government. I'm a candidate.
Oh, come on, you've got some pals. You've got more pals there than we've got the rest.
The point is, Lesley, that I haven't been involved in any of the discussions in the UK government. So to give you an answer, I cannot do so. However, what I can do is give you an answer that is informed by what I've seen. And that would be, for example, earlier on, I think it was Jamie. I think Jamie, when Jamie was talking about kind of, you started off the introduction, which sort of set out the reasons why people aren't keen. And one of the reasons was that he mentioned about the Finnish government. And I would like to ask Jamie, why did the Finnish government start a pilot and drop it 2 years later and then say that they wanted to actually adopt a scheme that was more akin to the UK government scheme of universal credit? So, I mean, there are so many things. And actually, I just want to also raise a point that was made earlier. I think it was really disrespectful of some of the participants to speak about the DWP and the work coaches in the way that they have, insinuating that they haven't been doing their job properly. I mean, some of these people have absolutely busted a gut to ensure that vulnerable people are protected right across the UK. And I think it's just disingenuous to sort of suggest that these people who are doing their absolute best have not done their best for people. So there are a lot of reasons why I think that the UK government could perhaps not be persuaded to bring in a UBI. And I think those questions.
But we're not talking about bringing in a UBI, Rachel. We're talking about a pilot.
Yes, okay, a pilot study, because at the moment, of course, universal credit has been something that has been reformed, shall we call it? So 6 benefits have been rolled into one, and that has been worked through. Now let's look at the record of the SNP government. They've had devolved powers for 10 years. They've been delayed. They've even handed them back to the UK government.
That's not true.
It is absolutely true, Neil, and you cannot deny that. You've had 10 years of those devolved powers. We are the one of the.
We've not had 10 years of those devolved powers, Rachel.
Yes, you have.
Can I just step in here? Because Rachel,
you should be tackling all the things that you have not done in 14 years, such as tackling child poverty. It's an absolute shame of your government.
Could I come back in there,
yeah,
Lesley?
Just briefly on that, but I'm then going to go back and grant Rachel her initial wish and get her on to Jamie to explain how the Finnish pilot did or didn't work. So briefly on that question.
First of all, we are using our powers. We've created the Scottish Child Payment, which is which is already being delivered and is due to be doubled in the next Parliament if the SNP is re-elected. And that, from conception to payment, is one of the fastest social security benefits in the UK. So I think it's rather unfair for Rachel to be criticising this when most of the problems that we have faced in dealing with some of the issues that we want to deal with in Scotland, the DWP and not cooperating on a number of areas are the problem that we are facing. I talked earlier about the hybrid system, and Rachel can shake her head all she likes, but I have been working with the current Social Security Minister, Shirley Ann Somerville, and her predecessors in trying to get some agreement with current and previous Secretaries of State. Amber Rudd, I sat in her office to try to get some agreement on how some of these issues would work, and there was a complete breakdown in any kind of cooperation there whatsoever.
Right. And in the interest of cooperation, I mean, Rachel, the Scottish Conservatives have actually fallen in with everybody else to say that they do want to double the Scottish Child Payment, which the Scottish Government, the SNP, have brought in, except that you're not going to finance it till 2025, which is a bit stingy, isn't it?
No, it's not the case. I mean, we supported through the Social Security Scotland Bill in 2017, along with the Greens and all the other parties, to ensure that we reach these child poverty targets. And one of the things was to bring in a Scottish Child Payment. And we think it's only fair. It's been costed. and that doubling of that payment, you have an absolute guarantee from the Scottish Conservatives that we will do that. There are many other things that the Scottish Government could have done.
Like what?
This poverty issue out.
Like what?
Well, for a start, that they could, the things I mentioned in the initial introduction was they have missed their affordable housing target. Neil Gray's absolutely wrong. They promised to create a housing target of 50,000 in the last Parliament. They only built 40,000. And
there's something like a pandemic has gone on in the last year, Rachel. I mean.
Right, no, now stop it. You two, listen, I'm encouraging you, but this is not fair on the rest, right?
You're not obviously paying attention to what's going on.
Okay, so let's go to Paul. I mean, I've almost given up on the other questions that now seem a small lifetime ago, but you know, if anybody does want to answer any of those questions that did come from the audience about pushing back on misinformation, how people have no core recourse to public funds and so on.
These were all things in my mind, because when you are an elected representative, one of the good things about that kind of system of representation with connections to constituencies is you kind of have a finger on the pulse of what's harming a community, because people will come and speak to you about it. So it's a good feedback loop, and things like NRPF, particularly in a constituency I used to represent, where there's a large number of asylum seekers, for example, there was huge issues with that kind of thing, where people were outside the scope of support completely. But I think, going back to the point about misinformation, I think it makes life slightly easier, I suppose, in a kind of unfortunate way, because we've seen a doubling of universal credit applicants in the last year. But there's a significant increase of the share of the population are reliant on this. We've got 300,000 Scots on furlough. So that there's a doubling of youth unemployment in the last year. So that everybody's more and more people get a stake in this thing getting fixed.
So do you feel the stigma is reduced?
Yeah, I think so. And part of what I wanted to do to speak about it was showing that even someone who ostensibly had a sort of decent job could fall foul of the system. We're all ultimately only 2 months away from losing their income to relying on the state to have support. So I think we all have a stake in making this thing work and having a minimum floor. But really, what's frustrating me is that it's become a proxy for yet another dispute. As we've seen to play it there. And I think what we really need to do is try and focus on how do we build this system using the scope of the 2016 Scotland Act and some of the power. There was some good innovations there about split payments on UC, for example. There's more that can be done there around further eliminations of problems with it, to try and strip back more of the flaws in the system and try and deliver a better outcome for Scots.
But I wonder, with the thing of basic income, however, can you see a way, I think you were getting that, we're beginning to stray into kind of the national question there with the difficulties that are being posed by Westminster not being keen on a system that Scots want to move ahead with. Could you see a way to make it happen, to have a basic pilot in Scotland?
Yeah, I think there is a way of doing it, because ultimately, like I say, I don't think there is a big bang approach to doing this. I think we need to evolve the current system. So I think that the best way of piloting it is to do these incremental changes and try and test how they work. And a good way of doing that.
But the basic income guys are saying, I mean, I might wheel a couple of them back in again, that it's just really, really hard to do that if you can't have control of if the DWP won't play ball, and if you can't have control of benefits within that pilot system, you just really can't do it properly.
Well, my understanding is that there's legal grounds for the Scottish Government to do that on the basis of the 2016 Scotland Act, and the DWP should effectively act as a vendor to the Scottish Government. And there should be legal compulsion behind that. So I'd like to bring
Alison Johnson straight in on that. You do sit on that relevant committee. So is that potential fix that Paul's just outlined, is that a goer?
Sorry, would you mind just repeating? It was a bit warbled at the end. My apologies.
You want me to repeat it? Sorry.
Yep, Paul, I think you wanted to use the 2016 Scotland Act to basically compel some action from Westminster as a vendor.
Yeah, so like I've heard, for example, Gordon Brown was talking about looking at topping up child UC from £54. He was talking about going up to £94 and a further £40 for under sixes. So he was saying, that could be a potential solution to, we were talking earlier about how do you make it interact better? How do you have that automatic nature to it, rather than set up a parallel bureaucracy, if you like, a parallel infrastructure? Could you actually just say, well, the DWP serves the Scottish ministers as much as they do the DWP ministers? Can we actually deliver that system through that means? And is there a way of pushing the boundaries of devolution to sort of do that? And I think we should.
Right. Okay, so you've asked a question. Let's see if Alison's got a reply. I can see from Neil, who looks fit to burst, that he's got something he wants to say. But Alison from the Greens, have you got, could that work?
I think having sat on previous Scotland Bill committees, one thing that this sharing of social security powers makes absolutely abundantly clear is that you need to have really good intergovernmental relations, and you need to have really good relations between civil servants in Westminster and those working for Scottish government ministers. Now, obviously, I don't know what's going on behind the scenes, but it's really frustrating, isn't it, when sort of basic admin and data sharing seems to be such a massive hurdle. I would say to Rachael Hamilton, why on earth would you reject a pilot, which is, we carry out research into all sorts of things every day in Scotland, whether it's a health issue, and this is a bit of a health issue, isn't it? Because a healthy economy means you have healthier citizens. So
okay, but Rachel's already said it ain't her shout. So let me just carry that thought over to Neil. I just want a specific answer from you about whether or not you could do something crafty, as suggested there, with the Scotland Act to manage to get over this hurdle of not currently being able to move forward with pilots because you don't have DWP buy-in.
I'm not convinced by that. I haven't seen the evidence that Paul seems to have, and if he wants to publish that, I would be very interested to see it, because at the minute, and I take the example that he used around split payments, I was involved in trying to persuade Amber Rudd previously to allow the Scottish Government to pursue the split separate payments idea, and the hurdles that were put in the way, the blockages, the vetoes that came from DWP ministers, and those involved in the social security benefits that we were talking about were substantial. And at the end of the day, Paul knows as well as I do that right now, under the devolved settlement, UK ministers have the final say in the veto. So I know you're not particularly wanting to stretch into the national question, Lesley. I can understand that, but it does boil back down to when you've got representatives from 4 parties who want to see it happen right now. One that doesn't at the moment. The one that doesn't has the veto.
Okay, let me just bring in. I don't know, is Jamie Cooke still with us? Jamie. Jamie, if you're there, can you unmute yourself, or can someone who is a powerful person unmute Jamie if he's still with us?
I don't know.
Okay, Mike's still here. I think Jamie had problems with his kind of internet at the beginning anyway. Right, Mike, can you fix this for Rachel? She wants to know the answer to why the Finnish government essentially just left this at 2 years.
Okay, apologies from Jamie's trying to get Toby to bed.
Okay.
Like all governments, they take different views, value judgments. It was an experiment, a pilot of looking at 2,000 unemployed people. They're still evaluating the results of that. The results overall were fairly neutral, which itself is a major finding. People didn't sit on their couches and do nothing. Okay, so a lot of the criticisms of UBI about the work shy, etc., are just not held up by the Finnish experiment. Why they haven't reintroduced it or broadened it out for beyond the unemployed, that particular group, we need to go back to them and see what their deliberations are on the research, on the findings, because most pilots, most experiments are fairly short term. And yet a lot of the benefits of the basic income, as Jamie said earlier, about trust in yourself, self-confidence, come through in the longer term. So we really need to see a pilot, an experiment that continues over some time and is properly evaluated.
Rachel, do you have anything else you wanted to ask Mike while he's there?
Yeah. I also wanted to know about the issue with raising an income in terms of UBI, and then increasing the sort of median poverty level, which would then, of course, actually put more children into poverty. So it's predicted that with a sort of UBI at a low level, that 60,000 more children would be put into poverty. And these aren't sort of my figures, these are figures that I've looked into. And I think it's really concerning to find that it's doing the opposite of what we all want to achieve.
Sorry, whose figures are they? I missed the rationale there. It
So
means it's purely a statistical change.
Yes.
Because you're raising the incomes of those in the worst poverty, that it moves the median downwards, then that's just a statistical anomaly.
Yeah.
Nobody is worse off under that. Therefore, that's just playing politics, playing with the figures.
No,
if every child is at least as well off as before, then we haven't made poverty any worse.
But it would increase median income and move then the relative poverty line, and that's
How would it increase median income? It's a big criticism is it's
no,
very,
these aren't my figures. This is the IPPR.
Exactly. If the argument is that this is expensive, that it would increase debt for the country as a whole, then it can't increase median income. Can it? We can't all be better off, i.e. median income's gone up, and yet at the same time, there's more debt around. These sort of arguments are not helpful if they're not fully explored and examined. That's why I would suggest you have a look at the work of the Fraser-Vander Institute, who did a 189-page report to sit alongside the feasibility study. IPPR, yes, have done work, and we've worked with them, as have others. The median income argument is very much a statistical argument. It doesn't leave anybody else, anybody worse off.
Okay, thank you for that. Right, I've now almost lost place of who hasn't answered any of that round robin questions. Alison, have you answered one of them? I wondered if you wanted to answer the gendered roles worry that women end up, feeling pressure to become carers more.
Yeah, I'm not sure if they would or not. I mean, I suppose, one of the discussions earlier about the split payment was the universal credit going to the so-called head of the household, in many cases that of any gendered payment. So I suppose universal basic income, at least a woman would have some income to call her own. And the questions there were around £5,000 being transformative. I think what we're thinking here is that that's all the money that someone is going to have to live on. And of course, for some people, it'll be a cushion. For others, it may be, but we have to remember too that housing benefit and disability benefit would be available, and other benefits for those whose circumstances need it. I'm not convinced that it would lead to more. Obviously society is massively gendered. We've seen even during this pandemic that, people that I know that I think lived in fairly progressive, well-balanced households, it is the woman who slipped into doing the major amount of caring, doing the homeschooling, while, the man of the house has got on with his paid work. I'm not convinced that making sure that everyone has access to a basic income would make that worse. I'd like to think that there would be a bit more freedom there to enable people, to take up a course of study, or perhaps to afford some childcare themselves that might free them up. I think that's a very interesting discussion.
Okay, and is there someone, sorry, I've forgotten in this round? I feel there is.
Don't think so.
Right, okay. I wanted to ask then to look on this, we're coming possibly towards the last few sort of big sweeping questions here. I'm still trying to look through the chat, and there's kind of quite a lot of comment on stuff that's been raised already. If I'm going to move towards the end of the chat, if you've got really, really specific questions, can you just thunder them in now and I'll be able to pick them up. One thing that the organisers wanted to focus on was insecure work and the precarious nature of work at the moment, which is a massive, massive problem. So a 2019 report by the TUC found 1 in 10 workers in Scotland are in insecure work due to being in the ranks of the low-paid, self-employed, agency, casual and seasonal workers, or on 0 hours contracts. The OECD estimates that 14% of existing jobs could disappear, and a third are likely to rapidly change in the next 20 years due to automation. A universal basic income would give security back to workers and let them retrain and reskill when needed. So can I ask each of you, what are your thoughts on how you would protect insecure workers and meet the challenges presented by increased automation in the modern world, weaving in UBI as skillfully as you can? So let's see who we haven't started with. Paul.
Okay, yeah, it's a really interesting point. And I mean, partly it's a function of technological change and we have to be responsive to it. Someone mentioned to me before that the change in the post-war welfare state, they created the Labour government in 1945, the introduction of that improvement to workers' disposable income and their leisure time gave rise to the likes of the Beatles in the 1960s, because you had, for the first time, working class people were liberated from work in a way which allowed them to be creative and entrepreneurial. And it created, you know, one of the biggest cultural icons of the 20th century. You know, so just taking that kind of premise, if you like, even if it isn't true, but I just like the idea romantically that could have had a connection. You know, if that principle is true, though, in general terms, because if you are liberating people from wage slavery, if you like, or for poverty wages, both through, you know, trade union organisation, be able to build up the bargaining power of workers, but also giving them that capacity to be creative, have security, and also, you know, achieve their passions and their inherent talents, then I think that builds the wealth of the community and it builds the wealth of the country. You know, so it's kind of that idea that we need to gear ourselves up rather than kind of constantly pushing ourselves down. And I think that's the whole idea of a UBI ultimately. And, you know, it's an opportunity that deals with some threats. You know, so rather than seeing it as, oh, it's a thing that's going to fix these scary things that might happen, there's going to be a destruction of wages. Actually, what it's doing is pumping huge amounts of demand into the economy by increasing the marginal, what economists would call the marginal propensity to consume. Working class people are more likely to spend their income in the economy. They're not going to hoard it in savings. But also it gives people that security where, you know, say they wanted to go and set up a shop, you know, they wouldn't be able to necessarily do that if they were having to work in Tesco's, and giving their time to a multinational company. They could actually build something within the community that would hold wealth within the community. You know, so I think these are all interactions that are really interesting because we're looking at it from a wealth creation perspective rather than just purely about a transactional relationship between the state and the citizen. So I hope I'm not being too jargonistic here with what I'm trying to express, but like it's got to be seen as a whole society change about how we think about how wealth circulates through our economy, that it's actually a loop which is self-reinforcing. So if we're tearing income out and we're tearing capacity out of households, their ability to function and create wealth and be productive citizens is diminished. And that in itself destroys the capacity of both the local community and the state and the country as a whole to be as prosperous as it could be. So I think we have to think of it in those terms. That's why not only a UBI increases the bargaining power of the worker, because they're not having to trade their labour for such a crap amount of money, but they're able to sort of have more demand. They're able to have more bargaining power, but they're also liberated to do other things that they might want to do, whether it's caring for relatives, whether it's, you know, volunteering within the community and critical things that are needing done to improve the community, whether it's, you know, participating in politics, which lots of people can't do because they're working so much and they can't, you know, go to party meetings, for example, you know, or whether it's, you know, setting up a business and taking that risk that they wouldn't otherwise be able to take because they're tied to a job. These are so many things. And how do you even begin to sort of quantify that? You know, it's almost like an alternative universe of huge wealth that we could tap into.
Right.
Sorry, I'm way off on a lecture,
right. No,
but it's exciting.
I mean, alternative universes in a Hustings on a whatever it is Thursday night is pretty cool, actually.
Maybe.
But you're obviously massive, you know, very into this. But I'm still wondering: is Keir Starmer? I mean, is there an actual Labour Party commitment to doing something to bring in a universal basic income? Is it there in black and white?
Well, you know, I'm a member of Open Labour, and, you know, I work very closely with Annalise Dodds in Open Labour, and, you know, she is a sort of shadow chancellor. I don't know, I haven't spoken to Keir Starmer about it, so I don't know, you know, it's not a conversation I've had with the man, but certainly Annalise is hugely supportive of it, you know, very enthusiastic about the idea. But I think our purpose was, how does it function? How do you evolve towards it? I think that's the strategy. What's the transition, and what does that, you know, practically look like?
Paul, you'll understand that for lots of people, especially that folk that are a bit older than you, like me, the idea of slowly transitioning and evolving towards things, I mean, it sounds good, but actually, you know, that's the sort of thing, you get a 5-year shot at this and you could be straight out again.
It's my Fabian.
But what sort, you know, I guess people will just wonder what sort of immediate change it would make. But let me just bring everybody else in. This question about precarious work, Rachael, how would you deal with that?
Yeah. I mean, I've experienced a lot of this with constituents in the last 18 months or since the pandemic began, and I think that women have been absolutely adversely affected by this. We all know, and this is actually something we can agree on, is that women who have caring responsibilities have been the most affected and disproportionately affected. And so it's these women I want to see who work in the key sectors that were shut down, that perhaps they've been doing this job because they have to have a part-time role. Now, that is because of their life circumstances. But if a woman, say a single mother, doesn't have access to flexible childcare, such as wraparound childcare, I mean, the Conservative policies, as much as I might be the outlier tonight, I don't think anybody could disagree that we need to give more support to women, particularly in terms of the type of roles that they're doing and the support that they get behind the scenes. We also want to see a speeding up of the 1140 hours, which was delayed apparently because of a pandemic, but it was delayed before that anyway. I would also like to see, I recently was part of a podcast with Mandy Rhodes in the Holyrood magazine, and we talked very much, there was a woman from Scottish Widows on it, and she talked very much about how women are not as financially resilient as men because women put other people before themselves. And I think it's about getting right back to the grassroots, Lesley, in terms of ensuring that in education we are preparing women to be financially resilient, to think that they can actually get jobs in STEM roles, jobs that are better paid. And
Rachael, I'm sure everybody would agree with that. But just on the question there about the impending massive explosion of automation, the fact that some people will be leisure rich, others will be utterly leisure poor, the unfair distribution of income that will inevitably accelerate as automation kicks in. How do the Conservatives intend to try to give people less precarious lives?
Well, that's on the presumption that UBI is presuming that we're going to have no jobs and that automation will happen. I mean, how do we know that automation will happen? Scotland has huge cultural and creative talent, and that's just taking away from the fact that automation cannot run in parallel with those incredible skills and talents.
Okay. Let me take the automation thing out of it, if that's another red herring. Let me just say one word to you: precarious. Right? How are the Conservatives going to tackle the precarious lives of people who are on contracts that mean they will never be able to buy a house? They don't actually even know if they'll really have their kids going to the same school in a while because they've only got 6-month tenancies. That level of precariousness is not what you and I grew up with, right? So what are the Conservatives going to do to tackle precarious lives that leave people, to quote an Aaron Bevan, in fear? That document that came out after the war was called In Place of Fear. So people are fearful. Do you accept that?
Yeah, I mean, I know people that are in this position, and I was a single mother, and I was in a financially precarious position as well. Because I had caring responsibilities, I couldn't take on a job that I knew that I actually had the potential to earn because I couldn't do the hours and I couldn't meet the employment conditions. It's all about really getting to the crux of supporting women and ensuring that they can go out, they can have respite care, they can have somebody ensure that their children are going to get a proper breakfast and a proper lunch and that they're going to be fed properly, and that all these things can work together as a package. And I'm sorry if you don't accept the answer to my question, Lesley, but I think it's about a holistic approach rather than something that's specific, because I currently agree with universal credit and the way that supports people, including the way that the people who work in the DWP support those people too.
Right. Precariousness, Neil.
Yeah, I mean, I think we can see a speeding up of the progress that there was going to be around flexible working during this pandemic and people in more precarious work. That is absolutely clear. And I think we need to, unfortunately, the Scottish Government doesn't have control over employment law, but I think we're going to have a really fundamental look at, across the UK, at how we ensure that the opportunities that have been brought about during the pandemic around flexibility and about working from home, and about which creates opportunity for many people, including disabled people and others, can be realised, but also that we're ensuring that people are protected from the precarious situations that you're describing, Lesley. And I think this is, I know, one of the reasons why my former colleague in Westminster, Ronnie Cowan, raised the idea of universal basic income around 5 years ago. He was the first to do so, because it allows people, gives people security, it frees people up to be more creative, the point that Paul was making, and it is certainly an idea that I think has had its time in terms of seeing a trial coming forward to make sure that this is the outcomes are what we would expect them to be. But on top of that, in terms of how we protect people in the here and now, before a UBI, the SNP Manifesto has a number of areas where we're, as I already said, around progressing towards a minimum income guarantee, and also providing new social security support that ensure that hopefully we can fill some of the holes that there are in the UK social security safety net that have been clearly exposed during this pandemic. I think if we're re-elected, then I think we'll certainly go a long way to fixing some of those issues.
But I mean, just on the specific thing of precarious jobs that are 0 hours contracts or whatever, could the Scottish Government not change its procurement rules? Or I don't know, perhaps it has a kind of veto on actually taking in contract tenders from people who are, from companies that are essentially employing people in precarious ways. You've got some clout with procurement, and indeed your example might cause councils to follow suit.
Yes, there are some areas where I think there is merit in that. The procurement law is difficult in this area, and it's not always clear that we would be able to use procurement in all the areas that we're looking at just now. But we have used the opportunities that we have under devolution to bring forward the likes of the business pledge, which is seeing, I've got the real living wage badge on right now, which is about bringing about better employment situations on a voluntary basis. We can't mandate, because we're not in control of employment law, but even without that, we've still been working using the likes of the business pledge to try to make the situation better for employees across Scotland. And as a result, I feel it's realised that in Scotland we have the most amount of people, a disproportionately higher number of people in Scotland compared to the rest of the UK that are paid the real living wage, and that is undoubtedly down to the work of the Scottish Government and the business pledge.
Alison, precarious work, Greens proposals?
Sorry, trying to unmute there. Yeah. I think we have to question why precarious work is such an issue. I mean, as you say, it wasn't something that I grew up with to the extent that it exists now. You know, the gig economy, the number of people who are juggling 1, 2, 3 and more jobs to get by in a week. So I think we've got to challenge the notion that this is okay, that it's an acceptable norm. It might work for a very few people, but I think it'd be much better to offer people secure contracts so that they knew how many hours they could expect in a week, and to make sure they were receiving a real living wage plus. And I think we could work better with employers and with the local and national government using the procurement system to incentivise those steps. You know, I think where UBI and precarious work sort of, it would be helpful, wouldn't it, for absolutely everyone to have a cushion. You know, the issue of the waspy woman has been raised in the chat. So that cushion would be very welcome. And also, you know, I grew up at a time where there was food banks weren't a thing. The proliferation of food banks is a national disgrace. It's not something we should come to rely on. It is absolutely the case that we should make sure people have got enough cash in their pockets. You know, if we talk about fuel poverty, food poverty, period poverty, there's an increasing list of poverties, but it all comes down to not having enough money. And the number of people who are in work and in poverty continues to increase. That is a great concern. Why have we got companies who are paying shareholders hefty dividends? They're seeing things going tremendously well for them, and the same companies are hardly paying their employees a living wage. These companies are offering these precarious hours. I mean, that simply shouldn't be allowed. And I think government could take a far stronger hand in, influencing that behaviour. But
Right.
I think obviously, for people in precarious employment, if you knew that you had an unconditional regular income coming in, that would help you certainly sleep a little easier at night.
Let me, before I come to Julia, let me just bring Mike Danson back in again, because there's just one question which I do remember actually was brought up at the Finish event in Tampere. Are you still there, Mike? Which was, this is a question Diana's put in the chat, which is UBI actually supports precarious work because it takes pressure off employers to provide a full-time wage. Now, there was some chat about this at that Finish event, that actually that could be perhaps an unintended consequence, that employers would know you've basically got a certain income every month that's coming from the state, and that wages would actually decrease as a result.
Yeah, a good question. A lot in the trade union movement are concerned about that. However, a lot of the precariats and those who organise amongst them think would have the opposite effect. In other words, you can say no to that poverty wage. You're not threatened with sanctions under UBI. You therefore have the power to go to a different employer, to bargain collectively. And therefore, an argument, I'm a Labour economist, an argument that I would run with is it actually improves the bargaining position of the low paid, particularly when they're being organised by trade unions and such.
Okay, that was a very short, succinct and sweet. I see Ronnie Cowan, who's been mentioned many times, is in the chat, and he's saying if you have a basic income, you're not held to ransom. So same point. Julia, right. Precarious work. What are the Scottish Lib Dems proposing to do?
Yeah, so precarious jobs, but also needing to change jobs as changes to the workplace are happening. So you talked about automation, we talked about transition to green jobs perhaps from the oil and gas industry. So there's several things. There's about ensuring that the employment rights are appropriate. And so we, of course, support the concept of having a living wage. We've also talked a lot about how women have been affected a lot by these precarious jobs during the pandemic, but young people in particular have had a huge amount of instability in their opportunities to work over the last wee while, and that is a big issue that we're going to have to look at moving forward. So from a Lib Dem perspective, we're looking at support for retraining, young person's guarantee. So this is about how to ensure that a young person has a job or is in education or volunteer work moving forward, to remove some of that precarious element, but also to upskill them for the future. But also a training bond for those who wish to change career later on. So a specific amount of money that's made available to people to retrain for different careers. So again, trying to minimise the precarious nature of their current situation. The only other thing I was going to say is that because we don't have a UBI system, is that we're having to find lots of workarounds in terms of additional grants and supports and allowances, which are to deal with this particular issue. So if we had a UBI system in place, then we wouldn't necessarily need to be finding all those other tools in our toolkit to help move our people forward. Again, on the precarious nature, we do believe that people should have a right to a fixed term contract or fixed contract after being working for 12 months. And also we're talking about, because of the instability in a 0 hours contract, that they should be paying more than the hourly rate that's currently being paid as a minimum. And then finally, in terms of looking at the hourly rate, we still question why, if you're doing the same job, should young people be paid less based on their age if you're working at the equal pay for an equal job. So again, those are the things that we need to be pushing for moving forward.
Right. Okay, well, look, thanks everybody for that. I'm just seeing in the chat as well that Rachel's had to go because she's got another meeting to go to, and perhaps that will also be the case for our other hard-worked candidates tonight.
I'll offer a quick view on this if it's okay.
Yeah.
All right. So it was just, I think the point about collective bargaining is really important, but also it's also about employment opportunities. So having a guaranteed job offer is a big offer. And I think it's a really important one that will sort of improve the access to work for young people in particular, which we've seen a huge spike in youth unemployment. And I think another key aspect that the UBI helps with is that pressure on new businesses setting up as well, because it's actually helping with improving standards generally. So I think that's a key point about collective bargaining is something we need to introduce across sectoral bargaining across the public sector again, and it's something we've had a real problem with in Scotland because we've seen even where public agencies are not doing so, and we've seen efforts to kind of sabotage that effort in Scotland. We need to seriously grip that in the next Parliament and hopefully use that as a basis to bid up wages and bid up standards of income across society, because again, it's foolish that the state and the welfare system is almost subsidising poverty wages. That's not a system we really want to get into. And it's been a function of a poor trade union environment in Scotland over the last 30 years.
Well, I think an awful lot of people watching this would just think, just with the four of you who remain, perhaps it's a naive thought and a hopeless one, but for goodness sake, can you not work together to try, because you clearly are singing off the same hymn sheet. It must be possible to find some way to advance this. And clearly from the incredible interest there is in the chat, I'm sorry to everybody, it's really hard to speak, listen to people and keep watching the incredible number of comments that have come in on chat. There's been a massive interest in this idea taking off. And I really hope that, I'm sure I'm speaking for everybody, I really hope that somehow you manage to find common cause in whatever result brings you closer to power. So thank you all for your points tonight. Thanks very much to everybody who stayed with us right to the end on the chat. Thanks to our sort of experts, Mike and Jamie Cooke. Connor, are you saying anything from Basic Income's point of view at the very end here? Which you'd need to do like lightning fast?
No, thanks, Lesley. Thanks everyone for attending. I'll send a message with details on the charity. But yeah, thank you all for your time, and thank you very much, Lesley, for hosting.
Okay, right, everybody. Thank you very much. Good night.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks very much.
Thanks.